Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now when I initially tested the ARC B580 I did so with an i9-14900K. I very briefly paired it with my trusty i5-12400F but ultimately decided to go with the more powerful CPU to showcase the GPU's full gaming potential. Of course this probably isn't a realistic real world combo, so today I'm putting the i5 back in my machine and bringing you 10 games tested at 1080p and 1440p. I am aware that there have been some reports of overhead issues as demonstrated in videos from Hardware Canucks and Hardware Unboxed. It seems as though certain games don't perform as expected with certain CPUs. I'm talking performance drops outside the norm, not just usual FPS loss expected from different tiers of processors. When I first saw these videos I wasn't sure what to think. I've been focusing on this card for the past week or so, talking about how good it is, and don't get me wrong, I stand by my findings in both the initial impressions video and the rebar on versus off video. That said, this is a budget card and one that will likely end up in a lot of budget builds, so it needs to work well as part of one. Unlike some of the bigger channels out there, I don't have a huge pile of CPUs or motherboards on hand. I buy most of the stuff I test, so when I'm done testing, I sell it on. The reason I mention this is because I'd love to upload an hour-long video testing numerous processors with the B580 in comparison to its closest competitor, say the 4060, to see how this apparent overhead impacts performance across various titles. I just don't have the resources. The best I can do is pair this thing with my low-cost, fantastic price to performance chip and hopefully help you decide if this budget gaming combo is right for you. I'm using the 12400F today with 32 gigs of 6000 MHz DDR5, and the B580 featured is the Sparkle Titan OC edition. I'm also running Windows 10 and resizable bar is enabled, a must for this card regardless of overhead issues. I'm using the latest driver available at the time of benchmarking, version .6256. There will certainly be times when the GPU is held back by the i5 at both resolutions, and other instances where the ARC itself just doesn't operate all that well with the game. Let's start with Spider-Man Remastered. Here we're running 1080p very high with TAA. Now as you can see by the on-screen overlay, the B580 isn't being fully utilised. That said, overall we are still getting 100 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 61 and a 0.1% low of 52, so performance as far as I'm concerned is pretty good. We can see the clock speed is hitting its max of 2850 MHz, but the utilisation at this resolution is all over the place. Now if we switch to 1440p, interestingly, the performance doesn't really change. In fact, the recorded frame rate was actually 1 FPS less and the percentile lows were very similar. This time around the GPU is being utilised more, but I guess this goes to show that our CPU is the limitation here. Next up we have Baldur's Gate 3, 1080p high with TAA enabled here. At this resolution we're seeing 111 frames per second with a 1% low of 73 and a 0.1% low of 48, so there are some areas whereby our CPU is probably holding us back a bit here. 1440p, this is more what we would expect to see across a lot of games, with the average performance dropping to 82 FPS here. Now when you up the resolution and the graphics card is the limitation, you expect this average to drop. This is normal behaviour. As you can see here, the percentile lows have also dropped to 60 and 42 and represent an okay experience in terms of consistency, but there are a few dips and drops that do remain. The i5 is probably one of the weakest CPUs I'd consider pairing with the B580 realistically, and you're definitely going to need resizable bar. That's regardless of any other issues that may occur, to be fair. We've got the Black Myth Wukong benchmark run now, 1080p first of all with low and TSR. This is of course left at 100% resolution scaling. 68 FPS was the average, and honestly this was quite surprising. This game is definitely more GPU intensive, as you can see here, and we can get away with a slightly weaker processor. There isn't much of a limitation as far as this one is concerned. We're getting a decent overall average and pretty respectable percentile lows here according to the benchmark run. Again, when we switch to 1440p, this is what I'd expect to see from an increase in resolution, a drop in the average frame rate, this time to 48 FPS. The 1% low was 40 and the 0.1% low was 38. So this was actually a very consistent experience this time around. You can see the i5 is a very efficient CPU in terms of power. I still recommend it. It's like £100 here in the UK, and to be honest, if you're going to pair it with something like a B580, it's still a decent choice as far as I'm concerned. Counter-Strike 2 is definitely more GPU intensive than its predecessor Counter-Strike Go, but here we are seeing the GPU utilization. Well, it's not really being fully utilised. In terms of the percentage, we're hovering between 50 and sort of 80% utilisation for the B580, but overall we're still getting a pretty decent result, and if you're using a high refresh rate monitor, then it's going to be a decent experience. 299 was the average with a 1% low of 137 and a 0.1% low of 126. At 1440p, we do see an increase in that GPU utilisation as expected. We're now hovering between sort of 80 and 99%. Our average frame rate has of course dropped to 251, still a respectable result here, and our percentile lows aren't too bad either. I definitely think that the B580 is a capable 1440p card. It does depend on the game, of course, as it does with any GPU, but I am impressed with its performance in pairing with the 12400F so far. GTA 5 up next. This does have a few issues with the ARC B580. I'm pretty sure I've experienced issues with ARC cards and GTA 5 beforehand anyway. This is of course a DX11 game. We have seen some improvements with older games and ARC architecture over the years, thanks to, well, not just the architecture itself, I'm sure, but driver updates as well. And performance is okay, but I think we'd expect a little more from a game of this age. As we can see, the GPU utilization is sort of all over the place. When we switch to 1440p, we're getting basically the same FPS, 90 overall. The footage does, of course, look different in some of the games I've tested, but I have repeated the same run for the benchmark figures and then just thrown up different gameplay to keep it a bit more interesting. But overall, the average was the same 90 FPS and the percentile lows were similar. If anything, at 1440p, the 0.1% low was better. It was 56 this time around as opposed to the 49 that we saw beforehand. So definitely playable, but we're still seeing utilization issues here. Hogwarts Legacy is a game that I've had issues with before in terms of consistency in regards to those frame times. Our average at 1080p is 96, which is pretty decent, but the 1% low of 38 and the 0.1% low of 15 does indicate some problems with smooth gameplay. As you can see, I'm running around the town here and our FPS, or frame time graph I should say, is all over the place. If you look towards the bottom of the graph on the left hand side, you can see some serious spikes occurring here. Upping the rest to 1440p and our average frame rate drops to 84 frames per second, but again the percentile lows remain 39 and 14, so pretty similar to what we saw at 1080p. That was 38 and 15, and now we're getting 39 and 14. So yeah, there are still some problems with this one. Definitely playable at high resolution, but there are certainly dips and drops here. The Witcher 3 up next at 1080p, one of my favourites. Ultra settings with TAA for this one, 133 frames per second with a 1% low of 90 and a 0.1% low of 77. So I think this is definitely very playable with this combination. When we move to 1440p, we're still getting a decent average 118 FPS, and our 1% lows are still respectable as well. 90 FPS here, the same as it was at 1080p, and our 0.1% figure was a very nice 69 FPS. So overall, Witcher 3 is performing well on this combination, and as you can see from the on-screen graph, our card is better utilised here, hitting at least 90% in terms of that percentage. Stalker 2 next at 1080p. We weren't quite able to hit 60 frames per second, but we came pretty close. 59 here with a 1% low of 39 and a 0.1% low of 34. This did better than I thought, to be fair, with the i5 12400F in the system. We're just trying to infiltrate this old warehouse here, retaining the medium settings of course at 1440p, and we see a drop in the average performance to 46 frames per second. This is a very demanding game. The percentile lows were still pretty similar, 38 and 34 compared to what we saw before, 39 and 34, so not much has actually changed in that regard. But performance overall is probably what you would expect from the 12400F and B580 in combination. There are going to be some games that really do put this hardware through its paces, and this is certainly one of them. Call of Duty Black Ops 6 now, 1080p with the basic settings, 110 FPS at 1080p. This is pretty decent as far as I'm concerned. The 1% low was 66 and the 0.1% low was 25. So definitely a couple of dips and drops here. When we switch to 1440p, we're still seeing plus 60 FPS, 85 this time around. This is doing better than I remember. Perhaps it's due to the driver update, the most recent drivers, 85 FPS, a 1% low of 56, and still a couple of issues with that percentile number here, 25, same as it was before, but for the most part, Call of Duty Black Ops 6 at the basic settings is running fairly well. You could even boost the visual options up a bit if you wanted to, but I'd recommend sticking with basic, especially at this higher res. Our penultimate title, Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p high, returned 87 frames per second with a 1% low of 62 and a 0.1% low of 47. Even in downtown Night City, our system is holding up fairly well. Remember, I am using the i5-12400F in a DDR5 machine, but it can also be paired with DDR4. Some games you're not really going to see much of a difference at all, and others may be more impacted, but here it's running fairly well. When we make the move to 1440p here, we're still getting plus 60 FPS without any upscaling, as pretty much throughout the entire video. I haven't used upscaling anywhere today. 64 frames per second this time around with a 1% low of 47 and a 0.1% low of 30. I think if we were using an 8GB card now, or if this card had 8 gigs I should say, we'd be in a bit more trouble, but it's still running fairly well at 1440p. I'd perhaps recommend sticking to 1080p for this one, or if you want to go with 1440p in this combination, then perhaps implementing a little bit of upscaling wouldn't go amiss to get the most from this GPU here. We're going to finalise with Red Dead Redemption 2, which is still seeing a few problems. When we make our way into the centre of Valentine, we see some weird utilisation problems. This has been the case even when I tested my i9. We do see some drops to performance, so much so that I was even seeing under 60 FPS, going from 103 as an average to less than 60 is certainly noticeable, but this only seemed to occur in and around Valentine. The same thing did happen at 1440p as well. We were seeing some drops, not as bad. The average was 90 overall, and we were dropping to 60, not constantly, but I did notice one or two drops to 60 FPS or thereabouts. Only in and around Valentine though, which was weird. We had some weird utilization problems. Seemed to be better than it was at first with the launch drivers of the card, but I think there is still something to fix here. Overall then, the i5-12400F and the ARC B580, from the games I've tested, seems to be a pretty solid combination. Of course, with the recent revelation in regard to overhead problems, there are going to be some games, I'm sure, that will suffer, and there are going to be other CPUs that will suffer in pairing with this GPU as well. As I said, all I can do is test the hardware I have. From what I've seen today, it seems to be doing fairly well. I'd advise you to wait for more data, I think. At this point, I'm sure you're going to see some videos from Hardware Unboxed very soon, and it'll be interesting to see what the findings are in regards to using certain CPUs with this GPU. All I can say for sure, though, is that you're going to want something that supports rebar regardless, because that is almost a must for Intel ARC cards and gaming. But let me know what you think below of this combination. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you all again next time.